I'm 67 years old, and I need to tell you something that might surprise you. After years of pulling away from people, after convinced myself that solitude was the answer, after building walls around my peace and quiet, I've completely reversed course. And let me tell you, it's been the most unexpectedly transformative decision of my entire life. Now, I know what you're thinking. Every piece of advice out there tells us that as we age, we should protect our energy, guard our time, minimize our social circles. And honestly, I believed that too. I spent my mid-60s convinced that avoiding people was the path to contentment. But here's what nobody talks about. There's a massive difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself. And I didn't realize I'd crossed that line until something happened that shook me to my core. 3 months ago, I attended a funeral for someone I used to know. We weren't close anymore. In fact, I deliberately distanced myself from him years earlier because I thought he was draining my energy. Standing there, listening to his children talk about how lonely he'd felt in his final years, how he'd wished for more connection, how he'd isolated himself thinking it would bring peace, I saw my own future staring back at me, and it terrified me. That moment sparked a journey I never expected to take at this age, a journey back toward people, back toward community, back toward the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of human connection. And what I've discovered has completely rewritten my understanding of what it means to age well.
Let me start by saying something controversial. The narrative that we should shrink our social lives as we age is one of the most dangerous myths we've embraced in modern aging culture, and I bought into it completely. For years, I convinced myself that stepping back from relationships was wisdom. I'd tell myself stories about how I was protecting my peace, honoring my boundaries, choosing quality over quantity. And while there was truth in those ideas, I'd twisted them into something else entirely. I wasn't being selective, I was being fearful. Here's what I've come to understand. When we talk about protecting our energy at this age, we're often really talking about protecting ourselves from disappointment, from effort, from the vulnerability that real connection requires. We frame it as wisdom, but sometimes it's just exhaustion wearing a more respectable mask. Think about it this way. When you're young, you throw yourself into relationships with abandon. You have energy to burn, resilience to spare, and decades ahead to recover from disappointments. So you're generous with your trust, your time, your emotional investment. But as those decades pass, as you accumulate hurts and betrayals and losses, something shifts. Each disappointment becomes evidence. Each failed friendship becomes proof. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you start building a case against connection itself. I remember the exact thought pattern. Someone would invite me to coffee, and instead of feeling pleased, I'd immediately start calculating. How much energy will this cost me? What if they want something? What if the conversation is draining? What if I'd rather be home? And 9 times out of 10, I'd decline. I told myself I was being intentional, but I was really just being scared. The insidious thing about this pattern is that it reinforces itself. The less you connect, the harder connection becomes. The smaller your world gets, the bigger every potential interaction feels. You start to lose the social stamina that once came naturally. A phone call feels like a marathon. A lunch date requires a full day of recovery. And before you know it, you've trained yourself into a kind of social agoraphobia, except it's considered acceptable because you're older now and everyone understands you need your space. But here's the truth that nobody wants to admit. Isolation doesn't bring peace, it brings atrophy. Just like your muscles weaken without use, your capacity for connection diminishes when you stop exercising it. And the peace you think you're protecting, it starts to feel less like tranquility and more like emptiness.
I spent 2 years living what I thought was an intentional, simplified life. I had my routines, my quiet mornings, my uninterrupted days, and I was miserable. Deeply, profoundly miserable in a way I couldn't even admit to myself because I'd invested so much in believing this was the right path. I'd read all the right books, followed all the right advice, made all the right choices about boundaries and self-preservation, and I was lonelier than I'd ever been in my life.
That funeral I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just sad. It was a mirror. And what I saw reflected back at me was terrifying. The man who died had been part of my life for nearly 15 years. We'd served on a community board together, shared countless conversations about local issues, even collaborated on projects that genuinely mattered. But somewhere along the way, I decided he was too negative, too needy, too something. So I'd pulled back, stopped returning calls as quickly, made myself less available, eventually stopped reaching out altogether. I told myself it was healthy boundary setting, that I was protecting my peace. Standing in that funeral home, listening to his daughter speak, I heard something that stopped me cold. She talked about how much her father had valued our friendship, how he'd speak about our conversations, how he'd appreciated having someone who understood the work we did together, and how in his final years he'd mentioned feeling confused about why I'd distanced myself. He'd wondered if he'd done something wrong. I left that funeral and sat in my car for an hour. Just sat there, hands shaking, confronting a reality I'd been avoiding. I hadn't protected myself from a toxic person. I'd abandoned someone who valued our connection because maintaining it required effort I wasn't willing to give. That realization opened a floodgate. I started thinking about all the other people I'd let fade away. The neighbor who used to bring me vegetables from her garden until I stopped inviting her in because I didn't want the obligation of reciprocating. The friend from my book club who called less frequently after I kept canceling our coffee dates. The cousin who stopped including me in family gatherings after I declined too many invitations. In every case, I'd told myself a story that justified my withdrawal. They were too demanding, too dramatic, too whatever excuse made me feel better about choosing isolation over effort. But the truth was simpler and more painful. I was tired. Tired of showing up, tired of being present, tired of the work that relationships require. So I'd retreated, dressed up my retreat as wisdom, and convinced myself I was living intentionally. But here's what that funeral forced me to confront. What exactly was I being intentional about? What was I protecting by staying home, by keeping people at arm's length, by surrounding myself with silence? Because from where I was sitting in that car, it looked a lot like I was protecting myself right into a future that looked disturbingly similar to the lonely ending I'd just witnessed. The weeks after that funeral were some of the hardest of my life. Not because anything external changed, but because I had to sit with the possibility that I'd been catastrophically wrong about what I needed. That the advice I'd followed, the choices I'd made, the life I'd carefully constructed were leading me somewhere I absolutely did not want to go. I started paying attention differently, started noticing the pattern of my days. Wake up alone, coffee alone, walk alone, read alone, eat alone, evening alone, sleep alone. Repeat. And yes, there was a certain peaceful rhythm to it. But was it fulfilling? Was it nourishing my soul? Was I actually happy? Or had I just become very skilled at convincing myself that numbness was the same as contentment? The answer shook me. I wasn't happy. I was hiding. After that wake-up call, I started researching. And what I discovered about aging, loneliness, and health completely contradicted everything I'd been telling myself about the benefits of solitude. Here's what the science actually says. Social isolation in older adults isn't just unpleasant, it's deadly.
Studies show that chronic loneliness has the same impact on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It increases your risk of dementia by 50%. It elevates your chances of heart disease, stroke, and depression. Your immune system weakens, your cognitive function declines faster. Even your physical pain intensifies when you're isolated. But here's the part that really got me. The research shows that it's not actually about how many people you know or how often you see them. It's about the quality of connection you feel. You can be surrounded by people and still be desperately lonely, or you can have a small circle and feel deeply connected. The key factor is whether you experience genuine mutual understanding and support. And that's where I'd gone so wrong. I'd conflated quantity with quality in the wrong direction. I'd assumed that fewer relationships automatically meant better relationships, but I'd actually just created fewer opportunities for any relationships at all. I'd thrown out the baby with the bathwater, eliminating the possibility of meaningful connection in my quest to avoid draining ones. There's also fascinating research about something called social integration, which is different from just having friends. It's about feeling part of something larger than yourself, contributing to a community, having roles and purposes that connect you to others. And this type of integration is one of the strongest predictors of healthy aging and longevity. Think about the blue zones, those regions of the world where people routinely live past 100 in good health. One of the core commonalities? Strong social ties, multi-generational connections, community involvement. These aren't people who've retreated into protective solitude. They're deeply embedded in webs of relationships and mutual support. I also learned about something called the positivity effect in aging. As we get older, our brains actually become better at regulating emotions and focusing on positive information. We're neurologically primed to experience deeper satisfaction from relationships and meaningful experiences, but only if we give ourselves access to those relationships and experiences. Here's the cruel irony. At exactly the life stage when we're most capable of experiencing profound connection and joy from relationships, we're also most likely to withdraw from them. We've accumulated the wisdom and emotional regulation to have the most satisfying relationships of our lives, and we use that wisdom to justify isolation instead. Learning all this felt like discovering I'd been reading the map upside down. Every piece of advice I'd followed about protecting my energy and simplifying my social life, it was designed for people who were overextended, overwhelmed, drowning in obligatory connections. That wasn't me. I'd swung so far in the opposite direction that I was starving myself of one of the most fundamental human needs. The research was clear. Connection isn't a luxury for the elderly. It's a necessity. It's as essential as nutrition, exercise, and sleep, maybe more so. And I'd been treating it like an optional indulgence I could afford to skip.
So I made a decision. At 67 years old, with decades of relationship patterns to unlearn, I was going to deliberately rebuild connection in my life. And let me tell you, it was terrifying. The first thing I did was make a list. Not of people to avoid, which I'd essentially been keeping in my head, but of people I'd let fade away who I genuinely missed. People whose absence had left a hole, even if I'd convinced myself it was better that way. Then I did something that felt impossibly vulnerable. I reached out. I started with my cousin Margaret. We used to talk every week until I'd stopped picking up her calls consistently about 2 years earlier. I sent her a text. Simple, honest. I told her I'd been thinking about her, that I missed our conversations, and that I'd like to reconnect if she was open to it. Her response came within minutes. She'd been hurt by my distance, but never stopped caring. We talked for 2 hours that first call, and something happened that I didn't expect. Instead of feeling drained, like I'd convinced myself social interaction would make me feel, I felt energized, alive in a way I hadn't felt in months. I started saying yes to invitations I would have previously declined. The neighbor who invited me to a community garden meeting, I went. The book club I'd stopped attending, I showed up. Each time felt like lifting a weight I'd gotten used to carrying. At first, it was exhausting, but in a good way. The kind of tired you feel after exercise, not after draining yourself dry.
But here's where it got interesting. As I started reconnecting, I realized something crucial. The problem wasn't that all these relationships were toxic or draining. The problem was that I'd lost the skill of setting healthy boundaries within relationships. I'd only learned the nuclear option, complete withdrawal. So I started practicing something new, staying connected while also staying authentic. If a conversation was heading somewhere I didn't want to go, I'd gently redirect instead of mentally checking out. If someone asked for more than I could give, I'd say so kindly instead of disappearing. If I needed to leave a gathering early, I'd leave early instead of not going at all. And you know what happened? People respected it. In fact, they appreciated the honesty. Turns out, most people would rather have you present and boundaried than absent altogether. Who knew? I also started being more intentional about creating the kinds of connections I actually wanted. I joined a local history group because I genuinely love local history. I started volunteering at a literacy program one morning a week. I reconnected with old colleagues not out of obligation, but because I genuinely valued their perspectives. The transformation wasn't instant. There were awkward moments, conversations that didn't flow, invitations I regretted accepting. But even the uncomfortable moments taught me something valuable. I was capable of handling discomfort without it destroying me. I could have a mediocre coffee date and still be glad I went. I could disagree with someone and still enjoy their company. One of the most profound shifts was in how I experienced my alone time. Before, when I was isolated, my solitude felt heavy, oppressive, like proof of something lacking in my life. But now, when I choose to spend an evening alone, it feels genuinely restorative, because I'm choosing it from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. I'm resting, not hiding.
Now, I want to be clear about something. Reconnecting with people doesn't mean accepting toxic relationships or abandoning all boundaries. That's not what I'm advocating. But I've learned there's a massive difference between protecting yourself from genuinely harmful people and protecting yourself from the ordinary challenges of human connection. Here's how I've learned to tell the difference. A toxic relationship consistently leaves you feeling worse about yourself, not occasionally uncomfortable, not sometimes challenged, but systematically diminished. Toxic people violate your boundaries, even after you've clearly stated them. They take but never give. They create drama that pulls you away from your values and peace. But a healthy relationship that requires effort, that's different. Healthy relationships can be challenging. They can push you to grow. They might require you to show up when you'd rather stay home, to have difficult conversations, to navigate disagreements. That's not toxicity. That's the work of real connection. I've also learned that sometimes what I labeled as someone being draining was really just them being human. People go through hard times. They need support. They're not always at their best. And if I only want relationships with people who are perpetually easy and uplifting, I'm not looking for friends. I'm looking for entertainment. The real question I ask myself now is this: does this relationship bring mutual value over time? Not in every single interaction, but in the overall arc. Do we both show up for each other? Do we both contribute? Is there genuine care underneath the day-to-day dynamics? I also learned to distinguish between people who are temporarily difficult and people who are chronically toxic. My friend Janet went through a devastating health scare last year. For months, our conversations were heavy and hard. She needed a lot of support. The old me would have probably pulled away, labeled it as draining, protected my peace. But I stayed present. And you know what? As she healed, our friendship deepened in ways I couldn't have imagined. Now she's one of the most life-giving people in my world. Contrast that with another acquaintance who every single time we interacted found a way to criticize or diminish others. Every conversation became a competition. Every success I shared was met with subtle undermining. That's different. That's a pattern that doesn't change regardless of circumstances. The key insight? Healthy relationships have reciprocity and growth. Toxic relationships have exploitation and stagnation. and sometimes you have to stay engaged long enough to tell the difference.
Let me tell you about the things that have changed since I started actively rebuilding connection in my life. These aren't the things I expected. They're better. First, I laugh more. Genuinely laugh in ways I didn't when I was alone with my thoughts and my routines. There's something about shared joy that amplifies it. A funny observation that makes me chuckle when I'm alone becomes something hilarious when I can share it with someone who gets it. Second, I've discovered that I'm more interesting than I thought. When you're isolated, you start to believe you don't have much to offer. Your world shrinks, and so does your sense of what you bring to the table. But engaging with people has reminded me of my own stories, experiences, and perspectives. I'm not just receiving value from connection, I'm providing it too. Third, I feel younger. Not in a denying my age way, but in a vitality way. The energy that comes from meaningful interaction is real. After a good conversation or a fun outing, I feel invigorated in a way no amount of quiet morning routine ever achieved. Fourth, and this surprised me most, I've found purpose again. When you're isolated, aging felt like a slow march toward irrelevance and loneliness. Now it feels like the next chapter of an ongoing story, one where I'm still connected, still contributing, still part of something larger than myself. I've also rediscovered curiosity. When you interact with people, you learn things. You're exposed to perspectives and ideas you wouldn't encounter in your own echo chamber. My worldview has expanded more in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years combined. And perhaps most importantly, I've stopped being afraid of the future. When I was isolated, aging felt like a slow march toward irrelevance and loneliness. Now it feels like the next chapter of an ongoing story, one where I'm still connected, still contributing, still part of something larger than myself.
If you're where I was 6 months ago, convinced that pulling away from people is the path to peace in your later years, I want you to consider this. What if you're wrong? What if the peace you're protecting is actually the emptiness you're creating? I'm not saying you need to be social every day or maintain friendships with everyone from your past. I'm not suggesting you accept toxic relationships or abandon boundaries. What I'm saying is this: don't confuse wisdom with fear. Don't mistake isolation for intention. Start small. Reach out to one person you've been thinking about. Say yes to one invitation you'd normally decline. Show up to one thing that requires effort. See how it feels. Not just in the moment, but in the hours and days after. Notice whether it drains you or nourishes you. And give it time. Your capacity for connection is like a muscle. If you haven't used it in a while, it's going to feel weak and difficult at first. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It means it needs rebuilding. At 67, I'm learning that the best years of my life might still be ahead of me. Not because I'm denying aging or trying to recapture youth, but because I'm finally learning how to age in a way that keeps me connected to what makes life worth living. People, stories, laughter, shared experience, mutual care. This is my truth now. Connection isn't what I need to protect myself from. It's what I need to protect myself with, against loneliness, against irrelevance, against the slow fade into isolation that our culture tells us is natural and wise. It's not. It's a tragedy we've dressed up as virtue, and we deserve better.